Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on the path to zero net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. I'm Chris Field, Director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, the organizer for today's event. The Woods Institute is Stanford's marquee investment in advancing understanding, developing practical solutions to our era's pressing environmental problems. Woods scholars team with other researchers, governments, companies, and NGOs to build bridges from research to action to address challenges in climate, health, food, water, oceans, and biodiversity. Today's session is part of our webinar series to address major long-term issues. After today's webinar, our next event is a conversation about the new David Attenborough movie, Extinction, in 1 week on April 14th. For that conversation, I'll be joined by Paul Ehrlich, Rodolfo Dirzo, and Liz Hadley, who's featured in the film. In today's webinar, I'm excited to talk with three diverse experts about decarbonizing the global economy. We'll discuss the targets, the opportunities, and the barriers to a rapid cessation of greenhouse gas emissions to stabilize warming at a level consistent with the well below 2 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial. I'm sure everyone knows that we live in an era when technology, ingenuity, and dedication have led to massive increases in standards of living in many regions of the globe, but at the cost of rapidly worsening environmental crises, especially climate disruption. Climate disruption or global warming over the past century is a consequence of the release of heat-trapping greenhouse gases, mainly from the combustion of coal, oil, and gas for energy and manufacturing, but also from clearing forests, agricultural practices, and some industrial chemicals. 2020 was the second warmest year since we had enough thermometers to accurately measure global temperature, and it was by far the warmest non-El Nino year at approximately 2 degrees Fahrenheit above the level in the late 19th century, and more than 60% of the way to the global target of well under 2 Celsius. Despite abundant evidence that the climate crisis is real, and despite rapidly growing evidence that decarbonization is technically feasible, affordable, and rich with co-benefits, greenhouse gas emissions continue at high levels. Even the pandemic, with its huge impact on travel and other economic activity, reduced emissions of carbon dioxide by only about 7% globally. The Biden administration has launched an ambitious climate agenda and a commitment to reach zero net emissions by 2050. Today, we'll take a deep dive into understanding how to do that. The three panelists for today's conversation are Stephanie Rowe, Dan Riker, and Mark Jacobson. Stephanie is a researcher at the University of Virginia and a senior consultant at Climate Focus. She researches land-based mitigation, biosphere-atmosphere dynamics, and the terrestrial carbon sink's response to climate change. She's a lead author for the IPCC AR6 and a contributing author for the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. Stephanie has negotiated international climate policy as a member of the Philippine delegation to the UNFCCC and has advised government agencies on land use planning and climate policy. Among many recognitions, Stephanie won the Patagonia Business Case Competition and the Mari Environmental Prize. Dan is a senior research scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, a distinguished associate at Energy Futures Initiative, and a venture partner at Ridge Lane Limited Partners. In earlier postings, Dan was the executive director of Stanford's Dyer Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance, director of climate change and energy initiatives at Google, and in the Clinton administration, assistant secretary of energy for energy efficiency and renewable energy. Active in both environmental and energy spaces, Dan's a member of the board of American Rivers and was co-chairman of the board of the American Council on Renewable Energy. Mark is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford. One of the nation's most prominent energy researchers, Mark's career has focused on better understanding air pollution and global warming and developing clean renewable energy solutions. He's best known for his work on roadmaps to power the world for all purposes with wind, water, and sunlight. His work has been widely recognized, including with the Judy Friedman Lifetime Achievement Award, listing as one of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy by Apolitical, and an appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman. The format for today's conversation is that I'll start with a few questions. After about 20 minutes, we'll get to the good part, questions from all of you in the audience. To get a question into the queue, type it at any time into the Q&A box using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. After the webinar, we'll draft answers to any unanswered questions and post them on the Woods website. Let me start with a question for Mark. Could you paint for us a very broad picture of what a zero emissions global energy system in 2050 might look like?
Yeah, sure, Chris, thanks. So what we envision that we would need to transition all energy. I mean, energy is about 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions and about 90% of all air pollution. So in addition to transitioning energy, we also need to transition non-energy sources of greenhouse gases, for example. But to transition all energy, there are four major sectors. There's electricity, transportation, buildings, and industry. And the idea would be to electrify all energy sectors and then provide that electricity with clean renewable energy, namely in our proposals, wind, water, and solar. So onshore and offshore wind, solar photovoltaics on rooftops and in power plants, concentrated solar power, geothermal electricity and heat, existing and maybe some growth of hydroelectric power, and also small amounts maybe of tidal and wave. But we'd also need storage, so electricity storage, heat storage, cold storage, hydrogen storage, and also expanded transmission distribution system. And we would need, to keep the grid stable, we would also need utilities to use what's called demand response management of the grid, which gives people would get incentives for using electricity at different times of the day. So this, the whole transition would be, there'd be no emissions, no combustion in this entire system. So there are no greenhouse gases, no air pollutants. 7 million people die from air pollution each year, and we would try to eliminate those deaths with this, as well as eliminate emissions associated with global warming. So it would be a cleaner society. We find costs would be lower, health would be better, we'd create more jobs, land use would be less than for fossil fuels, and we'd provide energy stability. Anyway, I'm happy to expand more, but that's—
Yeah, we'll cycle back to a bunch of these important points. Thanks. Let me turn now to Stephanie as we sketch out the landscape of a zero net emissions future. And there's lots of discussion now about using negative emissions, especially sequestration of carbon by plants on land, to offset continuing emissions in hard to decarbonize sectors. How realistic is this? And what's your sense of the scale at which we might get negative emissions by plant sequestration to operate?
Thanks, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. First of all, within the land sector, obviously there's emissions reductions that are needed to meet the net zero pathway to 2050. And then there's carbon removals. I think the dialogue recently has focused disproportionately on the carbon removals from land, primarily because it seems that we are relying on the land to deliver much of the negative emissions that are needed by 2050. So in our review of the literature, the high amount is about 10 gigatons per year that can be sequestered from reforestation, afforestation, restoration of natural ecosystems, but a more feasible number is about 3 to 4 gigatons per year. We did a roadmap for the land sector to 2050 to see what the land sector could feasibly contribute to 1.5 degree pathway. And we found that that land can contribute about 30%, and that CDR or carbon removal makes up about 50% of that. And in terms of the what's captured within that 15% of what can contribute to 1.5 degree pathway, you're talking about reforestation, afforestation, soil carbon sequestration in agricultural lands, agroforestry, forest management, as well as biochar. So I think that the feasibility around these things is certainly there, and we've had these technologies for decades now, and we know that they work. The only issue is that we need to be able to deploy them in a way that is strategic for the location that they're in, because planting one tree in one location is not the same as planting another tree in another location. And in other words, we need to manage the species and the ecosystems to make sure that it's not just good for the climate, but it's also good for the ecosystems that they're in.
And to put this in context, when we talk about 3 to 4 gigatons of CO2 per year, that's a little less than 10% of current greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a strong contributor, but not a dominant alterer of what we need to do in terms of decarbonization.
Right, exactly. So it certainly can contribute, but it's not by any means a substitute for emissions reductions in the other industries, including energy, but also including land. So we need to also reduce emissions in the land sector to be able to be net zero just in the sector alone. Land contributes about currently 25% of anthropogenic emissions globally. And so we need to reduce those emissions by about 85% by 2050, accounting for the fact that, agriculture, there's going to be some residual emissions that are needed in agriculture. So about 85% reduction by 2050, and then the remaining can then be carbon removals to be able to make the land sector net zero by about 2040 to 2050, and that we can achieve negative emissions after 2050.
Thanks. Let me just turn to Dan to talk about finishing this portrait of the landscape of decarbonization. I wonder if you could say just a few words about the big frame for how we think about decarbonization and how that fits with this broader vision for a sustainable energy future.
Happy to do so, Chris, and pleased to be here. My broader frame is a triangle of technology, policy, and finance. And technology is at the top of that triangle because ultimately we've got to develop and deploy a whole range of technologies that you've heard about from Mark and Stephanie, and there are a host of others. Energy efficiency, for example, has got to be part of the technology formula here. We've got to drive those into our economy and all aspects of our economy. But to do that, we need those other 2 points of the triangle. Policy is critical, and that's policy, law, regulation, and that whole bucket of requirements. And then finance is the business world, where the massive amounts of capital that we need to fundamentally restructure our energy system and globally and other systems. And we've got to put all these pieces together. I don't go anywhere without my favorite triangle. There's a rumor at Stanford that it's tattooed on my back, and I will neither confirm nor deny that today. But that, to me, integrating across those 3 points of the triangle, technology, policy, and finance, is really the key to ultimately succeeding. Too often we have people working in the technology area and are very blind to what's going on in policy and investment. Too often we've got people in the policy world, for example, in Washington, D.C., who don't adequately understand the technology area, or sitting on Wall Street with money that might be deployed, but are just clueless about these other 2 aspects of the triangle. So my whole career, my whole focus has been on trying to connect those 3 points of the triangle in order to drive the deployment of clean energy, in order to get to this ultimate decarbonization that we're talking about today.
Yeah, let me internationalize this point that Dan just makes with a follow-up to Mark. There's wide appreciation of the need to decarbonize rapidly in all countries. You've done a lot of work on looking at portraits for what different countries might do. Where are the best opportunities for rapid progress, and where are some of the big challenges when you look from country to country?
Well, it's interesting to note that there are actually 11 countries in the world that are 100% renewable electricity. But keep in mind, electricity is only about 20% of all end-use energy. But these 11 countries, they're all smaller countries, and some, there's like Costa Rica, Norway, Iceland, but there's also Tajikistan and Paraguay and Uruguay, Bhutan, Nepal, and even just in Scotland and Kenya are now. In Scotland last year was 97% renewable. But every country really has to participate, and the biggest one, of course, China is the biggest in terms of the emissions and has to participate. It's equivalent to like 120 other countries combined in terms of its emissions. But we found actually that every country, we looked at 143 out of around 200 countries, and representing like 99.7% of all emissions, and found that every one could do it. The hardest ones were the ones that are small, countries like Singapore, which have a lot of very little land and already built up, and might have to go offshore for their solar and wind quite a bit. but there's, so every country has resources. It'll be advantageous to actually interconnect, some countries with nearby countries. And so like we looked at Northern Europe, Norway has a lot of hydro. Denmark doesn't have so much, but has a lot of wind. So Denmark on its own, or Norway is on its own, they actually do better if they actually are interconnected in terms of reducing costs, making the grid more stable. So there's so much potential everywhere in terms of the resource available, having a combination of solar, winds, hydro, and some geothermal in some places, and also but using energy storage, and costs are coming down now that really every country can come into play. But there are millions of people, well, in fact, there are over 1 billion people without any energy worldwide, and there are another 1 billion people in energy poverty where they collect their own energy, like wood and biofuels for home heating and cooking, and that's really dangerous in terms of people dying from air pollution. So I think a lot of those countries really are ripe for transitioning and having a huge co-benefit of health as well as climate.
Yeah, let me swing back to Dan for a comment on the policy and finance aspects of this international picture. And we've recently seen an incredibly ambitious climate agenda rolled out with the Biden administration, but that's a US-based agenda. And I wonder if you want to share a few thoughts about how we think about internationalizing the goals.
Well, clearly we have to internationalize the goals. And I think that's obviously what the UNFCCC is trying to do. That's what the various climate agreements are trying to do. And then I think from the perspective of policy and finance, I think countries need to learn from each other what can work from a policy perspective. And as Mark just said, there needs to be collaboration among countries, geographically proximate countries, do things together to a greater extent than we're doing today. On the finance side, it really is going to take a global approach to finding the literal trillions of dollars that are needed to be spent to rebuild our energy infrastructure on an annual basis. And a lot of that's going to have to come from the developed world, and it's going to have to find its way into the developing world to make the kind of changes that we're talking about here in the technology portfolio. I would also add something else. I actually think that we need a broader suite of technologies than I think Mark is relying on in his projections. I do think energy efficiency is the place we've got to start. It is our cheapest opportunity. It's the low-hanging fruit. And as I like to say, low-hanging fruit grows back. We're always inventing new energy efficiency technologies. So that's got to be where we start. But I also do think that carbon capture for our fossil sources is a near and midterm step we're going to need to take. And there's been good progress on capturing CO2 from fossil-based generating sources and sequestering that. I do think nuclear is currently a part of the mix and is probably going to remain a part of the mix. There's possibilities of advanced nuclear coming into this. So I am, in my triangle of technology, policy, and finance, I do take a broader view of what the whole suite of options are, because I think ultimately it's about getting to those reductions. And I think we have to be open to a broad range of opportunities for doing it.
Well, much of the rest of the conversation will focus on what this mix might look like. But as we're continuing to sketch out the landscape, I want to connect with Stephanie again on the agenda for decreasing emissions from the land use sector, which are currently a source of 5 or 6 billion tons of CO2 per year to the atmosphere from land use change, with additional fluxes coming from processes related to agriculture. And how do you think about those in the context of the big picture of decarbonization? How do they get integrated with the ambition to decarbonize the energy sector?
Well, if I may, I wanted to add to what Dan was saying on finance. The land sector is severely underfunded when it comes to climate action and mitigation. There's about $1.3 billion that are currently invested in agriculture, fisheries, and forestry in tropical countries that need to be made essentially climate proof or deforestation free. So a lot of that investment is actually going towards activities that degrade or destroy our natural environment and that increase our emissions from the land sector. And so figuring out a way to maybe review agricultural subsidies or greening of agricultural credit lines, or figuring out a way also to support smallholder farmers that are at the forest frontier to essentially incentivize sustainable practices, I think is going to be really important to try to shift action in the land sector. Going back to your question, Chris, I think land emissions is something that the vast majority well, there's, like you said, five gigatons come from deforestation. That's, I think, something that the international community has thought that is a low-hanging fruit for a very long time. You know, most of the models will say it's one of the cheapest ways to reduce our emissions, but clearly it's been very, very difficult to do. The reduced deforestation program from the UNFCCC that started in 2010, you know, has had a lot of issues getting off the ground because of just the ability to actually implement policies to reduce deforestation has proven a lot more intractable than previously thought. In agriculture, it's also difficult because within the UNFCCC, they didn't even want to talk about reducing emissions in agriculture because, you know, reducing emissions is inextricably linked to food security. And so there's a lot of those trade-offs that need to be considered, and a lot of developing countries certainly didn't want to make any changes to agricultural management as it might potentially risk food security. So now that there's a lot of evidence coming out that you can do both, that you can improve management as well as reduce your emissions and also improve things like soil fertility and yields, there's increasing interest in trying to actually implement those management plans. So, for example, enhancing soil carbon sequestration in agriculture is a win-win, just because its ability to reduce emission or to sequester carbon, but also to improve yields through increasing nutrient and water retention in the soils. So we need to basically find win-wins like that. I mean, the land sector is very different from the energy sector and transport and others, in that you do have to think about other considerations, including food security and impact to natural ecosystems that might not necessarily be at the forefront with the others.
Well, I think this issue of co-benefits is an important thread that runs through all the aspects of the decarbonization agenda. And I might swing back to Mark to ask about the emphasis that you place on wind, water, solar, and how that aligns with the broader set of energy technologies that Dan has said might be necessary. And from your perspective, is it mainly a question of the co-benefits of decreasing air pollution and risk of nuclear accidents, or are there other motivations for focusing so strongly on the wind, water, solar agenda?
Yeah, good question. Well, definitely, I agree completely about energy efficiency. That's actually part of our plans as well. And we do get a big energy efficiency improvement and a reduction of energy use by doing a transition, because when we transition to electric, everything like electric heat pumps use 1/4 the energy as natural gas heaters. Electric vehicles use 1/4 the energy as gasoline vehicles. So we find when we look across all energy sectors and transition all energy, we reduce world power demand by on the order of 57%, just due to the efficiency of electricity over combustion. And in there, about 6% of that is end-use energy efficiency beyond the business as usual improvements. So definitely, the more the better. If we could do 100% energy efficiency, I'd be all for it. So, but with regard to the others, so we don't include carbon capture or direct air capture. And the reason is it always takes energy to run carbon capture equipment, and it also requires equipment as well. And that energy, let's say it comes in the best case from renewables. Well, then you have to look at, well, if you're going to use renewable energy to run carbon capture equipment, why wouldn't you just use that renewable energy to replace fossil fuel plant, like a gas plant or a coal plant? Because when you do that, you not only reduce the carbon from the coal or gas plant, but you also eliminate the air pollution from it and the upstream mining and the pollution associated with the mining. And the same thing with direct air capture. It requires energy, it requires equipment. So they're both, the equipment, by the way, is just an additional cost. So it's like a tax. And you're adding like there was in Texas, there was a coal-fired power plant, the only one in the US that had carbon capture equipment, Petronova. It cost $1 billion. And what did they do to capture the carbon from the coal plant? They built a natural gas plant just to capture the carbon from the coal plant. And they did that for 5 years until they realized this is a complete waste of money and time, and they mothballed it last year. And it was just really inefficient. The amount of carbon captured was not nearly as much as they claimed. And what did they do with the carbon? They shipped it to the nearby oil field to enhance oil recovery. And so you got more oil to burn that faster. Half the carbon was lost back to the earth through that process. Is the whole thing, I think, is a boondoggle. And I know people have good intentions with carbon capture, but the fact is it's always an opportunity cost. There's never a case where carbon capture is better than just taking that energy, replacing fossil fuel plants. With regard to nuclear, there are multiple problems. It takes at least 15 years now between planning and operation of a new nuclear plant. The average, like there's one that's going on 20 years in Finland. There's the Hinkley plant's gonna be 18, 19 years. Even in the US, there's only 2 nuclear reactors, both in Georgia, being built right now. And they're gonna be on 15 years at least. They just got delayed another year at least, and another possible $1 billion. They're way billions over. It costs 5 times more per unit energy for new nuclear now compared with new wind or solar, and it takes about 13 to 15 years longer, on top of the waste issues, meltdown risk, weapons proliferation risk, mining issues. It's just, why do something when you don't need it?
Yeah, let me ask one more question of Stephanie and one more of Dan before we go to questions from the audience. So Stephanie, Mark talked about all the challenges associated with carbon capture and storage from an industrial perspective, but you're talking about using growing forests as an approach to carbon capture and sequestration. And there are questions about how reliable that can be. And I wonder if you want to kind of explain the parallels between industrial scale carbon capture and sequestration and land use based carbon capture and sequestration.
Sure. It's interesting because there was a lot of interest in land-based CDR coming out of the 1.5 degree special report from the IPCC, since most of the models include land primarily as the one delivering a lot of the CDR. And recently, with Bill Gates and with Elon Musk putting in an enormous amount of investment in technology like DAX and other CDR type technologies, the conversation now is shifting in the sense that nature-based or land-based mitigate or CDR is
CDR is carbon dioxide removal for people who aren't the cognoscenti.
Carbon removal. Is that now it seems that investors are shying away from land-based carbon removal, mostly because of issues related to permanence. So I think carbon markets have tried to figure out how, so permanence is essentially that land, a tree can be planted one year and then it can burn the next. There could be a hurricane that wipes out an entire forest that was just planted, for example. And the way that carbon markets have dealt with that has been to establish buffer accounts or buffer pools to be able to essentially like an insurance account in case these pools end up either burning or you lose them before the end of the period that you want to account for them. So I think that there's that challenge, but I think again that we've been doing this for a very long time in land, so a lot of these mechanisms and a lot of these issues have been dealt with pretty effectively. And so I think that when we talk about investment in land versus investment in technology, certainly we need both. But we have to remember that investment in land and land-based removals can have many, many other co-benefits. So for example, restoring natural ecosystems can not only, deliver carbon removals, but it can also deliver an enormous amount of ecosystem services, including enhancing biodiversity, improving air and water filtration, and a whole host of other socioeconomic issues or benefits for local communities. And so I think that as the conversation starts to shift towards technology, we need to constantly put land forefront again, not that it can do everything, and we have to do it very carefully because we don't want to just afforest all of our natural grasslands, for example, either. But we need to make sure that it stays kind of at the forefront to be able to.
And one quick follow up on land, I think there has been a lot of legitimate concern recently about the risks of permanence or whether things are really additional. And it seems to me that what you're saying is that there are genuine concerns there, but that we have mechanisms for dealing with those. And the fact that these land-based solutions may not provide 100% of the carbon that they initially appear to provide, that doesn't mean we can't get the right answer and include them in our portfolio of solutions.
Exactly. Yeah, it's really easy, especially if you're already prone to prefer, as an investor, to prefer technology because it's just easier, it's cleaner to account for. Land tends to be a little bit messier, but it provides an enormous amount of co-benefits. And like you said, we've already established a lot of the mechanisms in place, many of which have been in place for 2 decades now to be able to account for those risks.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Let me swing back to Dan, and I do want to follow up on the dialogue about how broad this portfolio ought to be. And the message I take away from Mark is that technically we don't need to have a portfolio that's broader than wind, water, solar. But then I look at your triangle about the importance of policy and finance in addition to the role of the technology. And I wonder if that's where the motivation for having this broader portfolio is coming in, and how do you see the policy and finance sort of levers fitting together to craft a solution that could work in a way that might not be what you would pick if you just said, well, what's the best technology?
Yeah, Chris, it's a great question. And I think what it gets to is this triangle is complicated. It's hard to predict where we might go in the US, to say nothing of globally in policy. It's hard to say where the financial community may end up in the US and globally when it comes to all the things we need to get done. And so I think that leads me as a betting person to advocate for a broader portfolio, to just have a better shot at the kind of constraints on the temperature rise that we need to achieve as a result of technology, policy, and finance. We just don't know where the US Congress is going to end up on pressing policy. We don't know where individual large states are really headed. Look at Texas versus California on clean energy and climate. And we certainly don't know where the capital markets are. We did a report at Stanford a few years ago on what we really should be spending on an annual basis globally if we really want to have a shot at staying within 2 degrees centigrade. And that's basically well over $2 trillion a year, up from a total of about 750 billion right now globally, if we want to have a shot at staying within 2 degrees C. That's a big chunk. 2.3 trillion a year is a big chunk of all global spending on everything on an annual basis. And so
the global economy is about $100 trillion a year in an average year. So
that's the overall global economy, but annual investment is closer to about 3 trillion, and we need to be at about 2/3 of that if we really want to have a full shot at staying within 2 degrees C. So are we going to succeed at getting the big sources of capital, which are not government, I should quickly point out, they are private sources of capital? How do we get them to come to this? And the broader the range of options we've got in which they can invest, the broader range of options we've got in which individual governments can set policy, I think the better shot we're going to have at ultimately getting to those reductions in CO2 emissions that are so important right now. So again, takes me back to a broader than a narrower portfolio, allows for a broader range of bets. So focus on technology. Mark, I'm a big believer in solar and wind and hydro and everything else. It's what I've devoted my career to. But I really think we've got to have a broader suite of options in order to better ensure that we get to where we need to get to from a policy and an investment standpoint.
Let me give one more word to Mark. My impression of what Dan is saying is that there might be non-technology motivations for having this broader portfolio. And I understand what you're saying is that, well, we don't really need to have the portfolio be broader. If it turns out to be broader, is there a problem with that aside from the disbenefits associated with air pollution?
Well, there's a major problem because these technologies that he's referring to don't actually exist. Like small modular reactors don't even exist. Carbon capture is not commercial, it doesn't exist. And we need to solve 80% of the problem within 9 years by 2030. And we know just from the fact that nuclear reactors, you can't even build them within less than 15 years between planning and operation. So that brings us to 2036 before one nuclear reactor planned today can even be here. So it's a completely useless proposal to say we're going to use nuclear to solve a lot of, a good portion of our problem when you can't even permit it and implement it within the 9 years we need. You can put in wind and solar and geothermal to some degree, and also in batteries and all these other things. So, and same with carbon capture. It just, there are some pilot projects, but the only major one in a power plant has failed. I mean, it's a complete failure. But the problem is, even if when it's working, it doesn't do anything. I mean, there's no proof that you're actually reducing carbon. But people have these optimistic estimates, oh, we're reducing 90% of emissions using carbon capture, but that's just not true from the data from the actual coal-fired power plant that it was on. You actually look at the data and it's much less in terms of the carbon, but you definitely have more air pollution. You have a higher social cost. It's also a tax on poor people. Why is that? Because, when you add carbon capture to a fossil fuel plant, it costs the Petronova costs $1 billion. You're getting the exact same electricity, but you're paying $1 billion more. Who's paying for that? Well, the electricity ratepayers are paying for that. And that's what happened. And who pays a higher portion of their income to electricity? Well, poor people. So it's basically a tax on poor people to have carbon capture. And I'm talking about synthetic carbon capture. I'm not talking about natural. I am for the natural carbon capture, like reforestation, reducing deforestation. That has a lot better benefit because you're not buying equipment. You're not using energy to actually try to extract carbon from the air. Why would you extract just carbon from the air or from an extreme when you can use that same energy to not only eliminate carbon, but eliminate air pollution and mining? We have 50,000 oil and gas wells drilled in the US every single year. And we're saying carbon capture is just basically a reason to keep fossil fuels going. Where 1.3% of all land in the US is occupied by the fossil fuel industry. And we want to just go state by state and destroy every state with pockmarks of natural gas mines, and just so we can have carbon capture just makes no sense from an environmental point of view, a cost point of view, an air pollution point of view, or a climate point of view, when you can do a lot more just by eliminating emissions as fast as possible.
I'm going to switch now to questions from the audience, and we have a really broad range, and we'll have a chance to cycle back and pick up a bunch of the themes that all of you have already been talking about. Let me start with a question for Stephanie. This one's from Paul Werner, and it concerns how we should think about building up land-based sinks. So there are recent articles arguing for natural reseeding as opposed to intentional plantings. Do you have any comments on what reforestation, afforestation approaches look most beneficial?
I think it's so we recently did an assessment across different spatial scales and across countries for opportunities for land-based mitigation, and for afforestation, reforestation really varies. I don't think that there's going to be a one-size-fits-all approach that you can apply to every ecosystem in every country. I think that there's a big push with a lot of the policies recently by countries to do kind of lots of planting very quickly. And so you have a lot of these massive tree planting initiatives, and a lot of them are not very ecologically sound because a lot of them involve monoculture plantations of exotic species that might have a short-term benefit for local communities, like eucalyptus you can use for timber and things like that. But it's actually shown in some regions of the world to be really detrimental, especially if they're planted in areas that are drier. So in China, for example, in the early part of their large AR efforts in the early 2000s, they had to essentially rip up all of the trees again because it just dried an entire region in the northern part of China. And so there's been a lot of learning with AR, and I think the kind of current thinking is that it needs to be done in a way that is ecologically sound for the ecosystem that it's in, and essentially implemented and managed in a way that can sustain that type of ecosystem long term. So restoring degraded forests, restoring degraded natural ecosystems is probably the lowest hanging fruit, especially buffering around more primary forests, for example, so that you can have both restoration of natural ecosystems as well as buffering of future degradation and deforestation of forests or mangroves or peatlands. In terms of seeding and natural regeneration has proven to be one of the highest sequestration rates when compared to things like monocrop plantations. But in terms of again, a one size fits all approach, I would suggest that it needs to be very location dependent and ecosystem dependent.
Maybe that's going to be a key theme of this whole conversation, is that whether we're looking at energy technology mixes or natural climate solutions, there's going to be a portfolio that's different depending on time and place, other constraints on the available finances and things like that. And let me ask a question for Dan. This one's from Paul Furmo. In relation to your technology policy finance triangle, is there an optimal or necessary sequence to the components, or is this a chicken egg conundrum? And how might the sequence towards decarbonization change when targeting different sectors, land use versus energy, and actor groups, public versus private?
Wow, that's a big question. It's a great question. I don't think there's so much a sequence. I think we need to be making progress, as I like to say, at all 3 points of the triangle. If we're going to have a shot at, as I keep saying, is to stay within 2 degrees centigrade. And I think there needs to be much greater integration across the 3 points of the triangle. So if you are in the policy area, you need to keep your ear to the ground much more carefully about what progress we're making and not making in technology, for example. Technologists need to have a much better understanding than they do to date about what to expect in terms of both new policy opportunities and new policy barriers. Too often we invent things with an expectation that somehow they will kind of deploy themselves, only to learn that there is some policy or investment barrier that prevents them from being deployed at scale. So it's more than anything else, it's not a sequence as much as it's careful listening across all 3 points of the triangle and better integration. And I also think this extends back to the way we teach in universities. If you're an engineering student wanting to go into the clean energy world, take a law or policy course just to get a little bit of a sense about the vocabulary. Go over to the business school and understand a little bit about energy markets and the investment world and early stage versus late stage capital and how we build businesses. If we did more of that, I think we would increase our chances of putting the right portfolio into place, country by country, region by region, and globally, and have the best shot at controlling carbon emissions.
And it's a great advertisement for the agenda of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment.
Absolutely.
Disciplinary approaches. Let me ask a question for that I think maybe Mark and Dan would both like to weigh in on reliability. This one's from Michael Kavanaugh, and it says 2050 without nuclear seems to be a difficult scenario given the reliability issue as seen by the Texas crisis, which has multiple causes. But it did illustrate the challenge. And how will the reliability be addressed, especially if you eliminate nuclear as an option? Let's start with Mark.
Well, first of all, nuclear doesn't really help in reliability because it's a flat baseload supply of energy, and you need to match the varying demand for energy, not flat demand for energy. But anyway, the key question though is how do you do it with just clean, renewable, intermittent wind and solar particularly? Well, first of all, wind and solar are complementary in nature. So if you have a relatively similar mix of each, it helps because when the wind's not blowing during the day, the sun is usually shining and vice versa. Similarly, integrating wind or solar over large geographical regions also smooths out the power supply. Then you use that storage. Well, there's not only hydroelectric power, which is basically a big battery, but there's pumped hydro storage, which is the biggest type of storage in the US and most of the world right now, but also batteries. There's flywheels, compressed air storage, gravitational storage with solid masses, concentrated solar power. But then we're going to be electrifying all energy sectors. So that's heating, cooling, we'd electrify, and also transportation and industry. And that actually makes it easier to match power demand because there are more what are called flexible loads on the grid. When you have an electric car, you don't need to plug your car into your house while you're driving. You have a battery inside, so you can charge that car any time of day or night. And that helps grid managers balance supply in the grid because often you have too much wind or too much solar, and that's when you can charge your car. So the grid operators use what's called demand response, giving people incentives like different pricing at different times of the day to give people incentives to use electricity at different times of the day. There are actually lots of ways to keep the grid stable. And we've analyzed this in all 143 countries that we examined in all 50 states, including Texas in isolation and California in isolation, with just wind, water, solar storage, and demand response, and interconnected transmission. We can keep the grid stable every 30 seconds, everywhere for multiple years without a problem anywhere in the world. You never found.
Can I ask a quick follow-up on that? It seems like the historical approach to grid reliability is just have way more capacity than you need and to have it all be dispatchable. And I appreciate that you can make things work if you have lots of levers to pull, but it's a really complicated calculation. And how much do you worry that it's just going to be so complicated that we're not going to be able to manage it?
Well, I think you're right. Actually, part of that solution is overbuilding, having more wind or solar than you need, because then when you have too much, you can then dump it into producing hydrogen or heat, for example. But it's actually working. I mean, as I said, there are 11 countries that are 100% renewable, mostly with hydro, granted, which is really dispatchable. So but there, Scotland's now 97% wind. California, for last weekend was 86% renewable for a few minutes, and 4 hours it was over 80%. It's now regularly over 80% renewable during the day in California. And we find that as you get to higher and higher penetrations, the issue gets solved. I mean, it's just because the grid operators figure out, okay, we need to adjust this and this. It's not like you suddenly go from 0 to 100. You gradually build up, and as you build up with time, you get experience. And this is why there's now, it used to be the rule was you can't get more than 20% renewables on the grid because of this intermittency problem. Now people are saying it's pretty common universally to say, well, it's a debate of whether it's 80 or 100% now. So I think by the time we actually get to 80% on a large scale,
itself,
that'll be between 95 and 100%. As it gets closer to 100%, I think the problem solves itself.
Dan, do you want to weigh in on this reliability issue and how you think about it, particularly in the context of Dan is a strong advocate for wild and free rivers, and sometimes hydro gets identified as how we're going to get out of this reliability issue, and it's hard to do that while we also have the wild and free rivers. Yeah,
so reliability is key, as we've seen recently, as in Texas. And so again, I'm a broken record, but the broader the portfolio, the higher the probability we're going to succeed at this. So, wind and solar need to be a real core. As I've said, I'm a big fan. I've been in those industries for decades, but we have siting issues there. We have challenges in long distance transmission and siting the kind of capabilities we need there. I think we do need to be more expansive within the renewables areas. I think geothermal in certain areas of the country is got huge opportunities. I think biomass done right, and biomass with carbon capture actually can get us not to net zero, but to net negative. If we can both use biomass as an electricity generating source, capture the CO2 and sequester that, we'd actually be causing a net negative decrease in the atmosphere in terms of CO2. And you mentioned hydro, the good and the bad. 100,000 megawatts of hydro and pump storage in the US right now. It's more than 90% of all electricity storage in the US is from pumped hydro. Add another 80,000 megawatts in Canada, and the two together are more than all the nuclear we have in North America. So it's a big piece of this. But Chris, as you mentioned, rivers do take it on the chin when it comes to a variety of dams. Thanks to the Woods Institute, we launched a major project several years ago to bring the hydropower industry and the river conservation community together. And we reached an agreement last October that would take a look at the 90,000 dams we've got in the US, only 2,500 of which are powered, and rehabilitate some of those dams to improve their safety, retrofit some of them. Only 2,500 of the 80,000 make electricity, so some of them could actually make electricity that aren't, but we also need to remove some. And we've proven that by removing dams on some rivers, we can restore some of the natural functions that are so important. So I do think hydro done right is a part of this package. But finally, I'm hopeful about Mark's vision, but I'm not convinced that it's going to get us where we need to go in the time frame that we need to get there. So I do think we've got to add these other technologies into the mix that we've talked about, including what Stephanie is talking about in terms of natural sequestration. We need a bigger than smaller portfolio, and we need to work at all 3 points of the triangle if we're going to get there.
Great. We're getting down to where we only have time for about one more question for each of you, and I want to start with one for Stephanie. This is in the spirit of sort of building out the portfolio. This one's from Tom Hirschbach. In popular communication, a lot of focus on trees when it comes to land-based carbon removal. Recently, though, I've been seeing info about soil-based carbon removal, especially through mycorrhizal fungi. What's your take on this, and is it all hype, or could this be a significant contributor? I think more broadly, I'd be interested in hearing about soils versus trees. And also, if you wanted to comment on the permanence of carbon storage in soils versus standing biomass, that'd be useful.
Sure. Well, when we talk about soils, we generally talk about sequestration of soil carbon in agricultural systems, because of course, when you restore forests or other natural ecosystems, you are improving the above ground biomass, but you're also increasing soil carbon in those ecosystems as well. So if we focus just on kind of improving soil carbon in agricultural systems versus restoring of natural ecosystems, I think we're talking about two very different things. Obviously, one is very related to agricultural management, and so I think that generally speaking, the literature has pointed to the fact that there are high uncertainties with soil carbon, especially monitoring, measuring it over time, and figuring out how long it will last. But I think the focus is on the fact that there are specific measures that have shown to significantly improve soil carbon, including shifting to longer rooted cultivars, for example, is a big gain. And then also things like reducing tillage and conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture practices. I think that soil carbon is really important, and even though it has maybe a higher level of uncertainty in terms of measuring it over time compared to above ground carbon, it's just more difficult to measure it over time. And you can't, and it's also you're able to monitor above ground carbon spatially with satellites and LiDAR, whereas you can't do that with soil. You have to go the old fashioned way and go to the field. So I think that there's some issues there, but I think that they're two very, like talking about the portfolio, they're two very different things. And I think that you kind of need to think of them together because again, you're improving soil carbon when you're restoring land-based, or when you're restoring ecosystems, natural ecosystems. And in agriculture, you're improving the soil for improved yields and improved agricultural land.
And the co-benefits of both really need to be a part of the conversation.
Right.
Let me ask a question for Mark. This one swings back to this issue of how to think about efficiency and conservation in the broader agenda. The questions from Luis Mejia. More low-hanging fruit for emissions reduction would be reducing material consumption. Can you comment on how this can be accomplished, especially globally?
Well, yeah, reducing energy use is basically what it comes down to. And so that's people are consuming less, but also transporting less. So working from home more would help. Telecommuting we've seen reductions of demand, especially transportation demand due to this pandemic. And that's a permanent change. Maybe more people will be working from home. But yeah, reducing material use. I mean, this is something that we should encourage. And I think you either need policies put in place or people's habits have to change. I mean, we assume people aren't going to necessarily change their own habits. And so we assume for the worst and try to do calculations based on kind of just projections of what current demand is going to the future, but accounting for efficiencies in the use of energy, like reduced energy use in like heat pumps and electric cars, but also using LED lights instead of old incandescent lights, people weatherizing their home. There are a lot of ways to reduce energy use in your own home, to go to energy efficient appliances, heat pump dryers instead of electric flame resistance dryers. There are many technologies that have just less energy requirements. And so I think that's actually educating people about what are the good technologies to get. I think that's an important part here. I don't know if we're going to convince people not to use their phone or to not buy certain materials, but I think we can educate them on how to reduce their energy use quite a bit.
Looking for co-benefits. Yeah. Let me ask a final question for Dan, and there's an actual investment opportunity here. This one's from an anonymous attendee. If you had $100 million of private capital to invest in climate solutions today, how would you allocate it?
Well, not being too cute.
Maybe it's an invitation.
Well, no, actually, I would put it into whatever can be done to influence what's going on in Washington, D.C. We have an extraordinary moment right now to get a lot done that we need to get done in the context of clean energy, climate, and the like. It starts with the Biden infrastructure plan, and it goes on from there to a whole host of things that can be done legislatively by a Congress that's now controlled by a party that really wants to get a lot of this done, and by agencies that are led by folks who can do these sorts of things administratively. So I would take, and I'm not trying to be cute here, I would take that $100 million and really see if I could influence the policy agenda in Washington, D.C., in Congress, at the White House, and in the relevant agencies, because this is the moment. And time is running out, as we've heard from Mark and Stephanie. And if we want to put the policies in place at the US level and then take them on the road internationally, because all of this has to happen globally.
Thank you so much. We're at the hour. I want to close by just making a couple of quick comments. First of all, I'm incredibly grateful for the insights from Stephanie and Dan and Mark. At least for me, the real takeaway from this conversation has been that we do have a wide range of options that are mature and they're really rich with co-benefits. And we have a bunch of sticking points that have made it difficult to get to the stage where we see the deployment at anything approaching the scale that we need. And the agenda for the future has to be raising ambition based on the demonstration of success, based on political action, and based on mobilizing the finance in order to see the kind of acceleration across the spectrum. The conversation also revealed that there are many aspects where it's not exactly clear what the ultimate mix of technologies should look like. And we should be open to learning from progress that moves along and to seeing technologies that look like they might be a little bit in the dark horse category emerging as their efficiency improves or as the cost goes down. This has been a really terrific conversation. We have dozens of questions that we didn't get to, and I promise we will post answers to as many of those as we can on the website. I want to thank everybody for joining today, and I especially want to thank our great technology team with Molly and Athena and Lee and Justin, who made all of this possible. So thanks everyone for joining.